Usually when we look at international alliances, there is this expectation of almost engineering level precision.
Right, yeah. Like it's all mapped out perfectly.
Exactly. I mean, you picture two nations, they sit down at a polished table, they identify their shared adversaries, and then they sign this mutual defense treaty.
And the diplomats hold up the piece of paper for the cameras, right?
Yeah. It provides this incredibly comforting illusion that global geopolitics is just neat. Like allied or adversary, friend or foe.
Well, it's just that human desire for categorization. We want the global chessboard to make sense with clear lines dividing all the major power blocks.
But the moment you turn that diplomatic X-ray machine toward Northeast Asia, specifically toward the border shared by the People's Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the machine completely breaks down.
It shatters.
Right. You are no longer looking at a neat chessboard. You are looking into a geopolitical fault line that defies every single conventional assumption about, well, how allies are supposed to behave. So welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today, our mandate is to completely dismantle a narrative that you see plastered across the news on a daily basis.
And it's a pervasive one.
It really is. It's that assumption that the People's Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are these ideological blood brothers marching in perfect, monolithic lockstep against the rest of the world.
And specifically against United States foreign policy.
Right. But we're going to show you why that is a complete myth. We are diving deep into a 75-year relationship that is defined far more by historical trauma, deep-seated resentment, and honestly relentless strategic manipulation than by any actual ideological harmony.
It's a fascinating dynamic when you really peel it back.
To do this, we are unpacking a phenomenal stack of analyses. So for you listening, we're pulling from the 2022 China-North Korea Strategic Rift Report, an analysis titled North Korea is Joining China and Russia in Confronting the United States, and a comprehensive backgrounder simply called the China-North Korea Relationship.
Some really heavy-hitting stuff in there.
Oh, absolutely. We are also examining the original text of the 1961 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, alongside two highly strategic presentations. One is titled North Korea, Preparing for War, Mere Blustering, or Something in Between, and the other is a very sobering look at why North Korea might use nuclear weapons first.
And I should definitely note for you listening that these documents dive into some highly charged, incredibly sensitive political and strategic realities.
Right.
Our role here is strictly analytical. We're just imparting the viewpoints and the strategic frameworks contained within these specific sources without taking any political sides at all.
Yeah, be they left-wing, right-wing, or anywhere on the spectrum.
Exactly. Just think of us simply as navigators trying to read a very, very complex map of international relations.
And my promise to you is that by the time we finish this deep dive, you will understand the hidden, high-stakes levers of power that keep the Korean Peninsula teetering on the absolute brink.
It's going to clarify so much.
You will understand why the United States is facing a puzzle in Northeast Asia that sometimes feels entirely impossible to solve. So to really grasp the tension today, we have to look at the paperwork that supposedly binds these two nations together.
The famous treaty.
Right. Let's look at the 1961 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. This was signed in Beijing on July 11th, 1961. I was poring over the translated text, and man, the language is drenched in this lofty, almost utopian revolutionary rhetoric.
Oh, it's very of its time.
Yeah, it leans heavily on, quote, Marxism-Leninism and the principle of proletarian internationalism. It pledges mutual non-aggression and mutual respect for state sovereignty.
Which is standard language for the era, but the status of that specific treaty is what is truly anomalous today.
What do you mean?
Well, out of all the bilateral agreements in the world today, this is the single, only binding mutual defense treaty that the People's Republic of China holds with any nation.
Wait, really? Just one?
Just one. China, which is this massive global superpower with interests spanning literally every continent, has only one formal mutual defense pact. And it is with North Korea.
That is wild. Which makes it sound, on paper, like the strongest bond on the planet?
A ball paper, sure.
But the historical reality laid out in our sources shows a foundation built almost entirely on historical grievances. It seems like these two nations have fundamentally mistrusted each other since long before that treaty was even drafted.
Oh, absolutely.
Take us back to the 1930s, when the leadership of North Korea was really just forming its identity.
Yeah, so if we look at the origins of the regime, the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, actually cut his teeth operating alongside the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay.
During the 1930s, they were fighting this shared guerrilla war against the Japanese occupation of Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. So at that ground level, there was a shared struggle.
Right, they were literally in the trenches together.
Yeah. Exactly. But the global landscape radically shifted during the Second World War. By the 1940s, Kim Il-sung realized he needed a different kind of backing to secure true power.
He needed a bigger patron.
Right. So he pivoted away from his Chinese comrades and aligned himself deeply with the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin.
Which immediately creates a dynamic of friction. Because the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union, despite both flying the red flag, were already developing massive ideological fissures.
Fissures that would eventually erupt into open border conflicts, yeah.
So right from the start, Kim Il-sung is playing the communist heavyweights against each other.
He was a master of that specific geopolitical game. I mean, he recognized that if he relied solely on one patron, he would be swallowed whole.
Right.
But the event that truly crystallized the modern, deep-seated resentment between Beijing and Pyongyang was the Korean War, running from 1950 to 1953.
Yeah, this part of the backgrounder completely flipped my understanding of that war. We usually think of the North Korean invasion of the South in June of 1950 as this coordinated, unified communist push.
A lot of people assume that.
But the sources point out that when Kim Il-sung initially launched that invasion, he actually refused military assistance from the Chinese Communist Party.
He did.
Why on earth would a leader embarking on a massive military campaign turn down troops from his massive neighbor?
Because it all comes down to control and autonomy. Kim Il-sung desperately wanted to be the sole unilateral conqueror and unifier of the Korean Peninsula.
He wanted all the credit.
Exactly. He understood the brutal calculus of foreign military aid. If you invite hundreds of thousands of foreign troops into your country to fight your war, well, those troops are eventually going to dictate your politics.
Right, you're giving up the keys to the house.
He was terrified that Chinese assistance would instantly turn him into a subordinate puppet of Beijing. He wanted a rapid victory funded by Soviet equipment, but executed purely by the Korean People's Army.
But the reality of the battlefield completely destroyed that plan. The United Nations coalition counterattacked, decimating the North Korean forces and pushing them relentlessly northward.
Right up to the border.
Almost all the way to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. And that is the exact moment when China, feeling its own borders threatened, intervened with massive, overwhelming force.
They just flooded across the Yalu River. And while that intervention objectively saved Kim Il-sung's regime from total eradication, it did not create gratitude.
I imagine not.
In fact, it birthed a profound, enduring bitterness. Because once the Chinese military took over the war effort, they took over the strategy.
They were calling the shots.
Completely. And by February of 1952, the situation on the ground was horrific. The Korean Peninsula was being absolutely pulverized by bombing campaigns.
Just leveled.
The infrastructure was gone. The civilian casualties were catastrophic. Kim Il-sung recognized the war was a stalemate and his country was being turned to ash.
Right, so he wants out.
Exactly. He wanted to seek an armistice agreement with the United Nations coalition to just stop the bleeding.
But the Chinese leadership vetoed him.
Mao Zedong explicitly overruled Kim Il-sung's desire for an armistice.
Wow.
The sources highlight historian Chen Jin's analysis of this dynamic. Mao chose to prolong the war for over a year, not to help North Korea achieve its territorial goals, but to serve China's grand geopolitical strategy.
So what was Mao's angle?
Mao wanted to bleed the United States military, and more importantly, he wanted to demonstrate to the entire world that the Chinese Communist Party held the morally and militarily superior position in directing revolutions across the East.
So if we look at the mechanics of what Mao was doing, he was essentially using North Korean land and North Korean lives as a massive, bloody billboard to advertise China's new dominance on the world stage.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Like, he was willing to let Pyongyang burn to the ground just to prove a point to Washington and to Moscow.
It's exactly. For North Korea, the war ceased to be about unifying their homeland and morphed into a proxy meat grinder serving Chinese interests.
A meat grinder.
And the leadership in Pyongyang never, ever forgot that betrayal of their sovereignty. Even after the armistice was finally signed in 1953, North Korea engaged in a systematic campaign to minimize or outright erase the massive scale of China's sacrifice from their official state histories.
Wait, really? They just wrote them out of the history books?
They refused to publicly acknowledge that China had saved them.
That is a phenomenal level of institutional spite. And the relationship only grew more toxic in the following decades.
Oh, it got much worse.
The sources detail the fallout during the Cultural Revolution in China, which ran from 1966 to 1976. This was a decade of intense, violent internal purges driven by Mao to eliminate ideological rivals.
Total chaos domestically.
Right. And during this domestic chaos, the Chinese government turned its sights outward and publicly denounced North Korea.
Yeah, the Red Guards in China, acting as Mao's ideological enforcers, began attacking Kim Il-sung directly in their propaganda.
What were they saying?
They labeled him a, quote, fat revisionist, accusing him of abandoning true Marxist-Leninist principles and becoming a corrupt aristocrat.
Ouch.
And the rhetoric escalated to the point where there were physical armed clashes between border guards along the Yalu and Tumen rivers.
So they're actually shooting at each other?
Yes. The 1961 treaty was technically active, but functionally they were treating each other as hostile entities.
Which brings us to a piece of intelligence from the sources that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I read it. We jump forward to the year 2018.
Right.
The geopolitical landscape is totally different, but the resentment is apparently completely intact.
You're talking about the 1,000-year enemy revelation.
Yes. According to the analyses provided, there were credible reports in 2018 that the leadership in Pyongyang privately referred to China as their 1,000-year enemy.
It's an incredible phrase.
But it goes beyond just name-calling. The report suggested that North Korea was so deeply terrified of Chinese domination that they were theoretically willing to accept a long-term United States military presence on the Korean peninsula just to serve as a counterbalance to Beijing's influence.
When you break down the psychology of that stance, it is staggering.
It really is.
The core propaganda of the North Korean state is entirely built around the existential threat of American imperialism. The United States is the ultimate boogeyman.
Right, that's their whole brand.
Yet their fear and loathing of their sole treaty ally, China, runs so deep in their historical memory that they would consider keeping American troops on the peninsula as a necessary evil to prevent China from effectively annexing them.
Okay, so we have to look at the mechanics of how this alliance actually functions today. Because if they possess this level of mutual animosity,
Right.
I mean, if Mao threw Kim under the bus in the 50s, if they shot at each other in the 60s, and if Pyongyang is calling Beijing a 1,000-year enemy in the Mao era, how does this relationship survive?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Like, why hasn't this 1961 treaty simply been torn up?
The mechanism that binds them together isn't loyalty. It is a staggering, almost unfathomable level of economic leverage.
Leverage.
China essentially holds North Korea in a permanent economic chokehold, keeping the nation on a life support machine that Beijing can unplug at a moment's notice.
The statistics from the sources on this economic dynamic are mind-bending. Let's look at the reality as of 2023. The reports indicate that China accounts for roughly 98% of North Korea's official total imports and exports.
98%.
It is hard to even conceptualize a sovereign nation operating with that level of dependence on a single neighbor.
Exactly. It ceases to be trade in the traditional sense and becomes total monopolistic control over a nation's ability to exist.
Right.
Through that 98% share, China is the ultimate provider of North Korea's critical food assistance. They provide the overwhelming majority of their energy supplies, specifically crude oil,
Without which the military just stops.
The North Korean military and industry would instantly grind to a halt without Chinese oil. And crucially, China provides the access to foreign currency that the regime desperately needs to survive.
And the sources detail the physical infrastructure that China has systematically built to ensure this flow of resources remains locked in. They aren't just sending trucks over a bridge.
It's highly developed.
In 2015, China opened a massive bulk cargo and container shipping route specifically designed to boost North Korea's export of coal into Chinese markets.
Yep.
They established a high-speed rail route connecting the Chinese border city of Dandong directly to Shenyang, which is the provincial capital of China's Liaoning province. They opened the Guminwan border trade zone. They are pouring concrete and laying steel to institutionalize this dependence.
Because that infrastructure serves a dual purpose. Yes, Yes, it facilitates trade, but more importantly, it provides the massive, deliberate backdoor that allows North Korea to completely circumvent the crushing international sanctions regime imposed by the United Nations and championed by the United States.
So China is basically the shield.
Without China acting as the intermediary and the shield, the North Korean economy would face total, immediate collapse under the weight of global sanctions.
Wow.
But the fundamental tension here is how the leadership in Pyongyang processes this reality. They absolutely detest this subordination.
And that hatred of dependence is rooted in their state ideology, right?
Precisely. The founding and all-consuming philosophy of the North Korean state is Ju.
Yushe.
The most common translation of Juko is self-reliance. But it is much more profound than just economic independence. It is a religious-level doctrine stating that true Korean dignity and sovereignty can only be achieved by being completely independent militarily, economically, and politically from any foreign power.
So you have a regime whose entire domestic legitimacy rests on the theological promise of absolute self-reliance.
Right.
Yet the mathematical reality is that they are 98% dependent on a neighbor they consider a 1,000-year enemy. That is a massive, humiliating cognitive dissonance for the leadership.
It creates a state of permanent psychological insecurity. And we watched this insecurity manifest in real time, in extreme ways, during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, right.
The sources highlight that North Korea was one of the very first nations on the planet to completely seal its borders in early 2020.
And when we say seal, we don't mean they restricted tourist visas.
No.
They shut down all legitimate and illicit movement. For a country that survives on informal cross-border trade, smuggling, and the black market just to keep its citizens from starving, a total border closure is a draconian, almost suicidal measure.
It massively exacerbated their already critical food insecurity.
Right. I mean, the United Nations agencies estimate that more than 40% of the North Korean population, meaning nearly 11 million people, suffer from chronic undernourishment.
It's tragedy.
Yet despite millions starving, the regime kept the border bolted shut to its primary lifeline.
Because the logic behind that closure wasn't purely epidemiological. It was an extreme manifestation of that Juche ideology.
Ah, I see.
A crisis was an opportunity to aggressively assert their independence from China, even if the cost was massive civilian suffering.
That's incredibly bleak.
Foreign goods, foreign medicine, foreign aid, these all represent foreign influence. And to a hyper-paranoid authoritarian regime, foreign influence is a virus far more dangerous than COVID-19.
Which brings us to the ultimate diplomatic insult detailed in our reading.
This is wild.
In August of 2021, the pandemic is raging globally. Vaccines are the most sought-after commodity on Earth. And the sources point out that North Korea flat out rejected a shipment of nearly 3 million doses of the Chinese-made Sinovac COVID-19 vaccine.
Just let the scale of that rejection sink in. You have a completely unvaccinated population, highly vulnerable, and your sole treaty ally offers you 3 million doses to protect your people.
And Pyongyang says absolutely not.
But it was the manner of the rejection that was so telling.
Yeah. According to intelligence from South Korea's Institute for National Security Strategy, North Korea didn't just quietly decline the shipment due to logistical issues.
No, they did not.
They reportedly rejected the vaccines because they viewed the Chinese medicine as, quote, ineffective.
Which is an incredibly calculated slap in the face to Beijing. At that exact moment, in 2021, China was engaged in a massive global campaign of vaccine diplomacy.
Trying to win hearts and minds.
Right. They were shipping Sinovac all over the developing world, trying to position the Chinese Communist Party as the scientific and humanitarian savior of the global South.
And their own backyard ally, a nation entirely dependent on them for its daily bread, publicly announces to the world, no thank you, we don't trust your science.
It is a staggering display of arrogance, but it perfectly illustrates how desperately North Korea needs to perform this theater of independence.
So this raises the ultimate question. If North Korea is this resistant, this insulting, and this massive of an economic drain, why doesn't China just cut the cord?
It seems like the logical move.
Like, why doesn't Beijing simply halt the coal imports, shut off the crude oil pipeline, and let the Kim regime collapse under the weight of its own contradictions?
To understand China's restraint, you really have to look deeply at the geography of the border. This is not a barren desert or a massive ocean separating the two nations.
Right, it's a river border.
The border is defined by the Yalu and Tumen rivers, and the communities on either side are deeply, deeply intertwined.
The sources specifically highlight the Yanbian Autonomous Region in China. What is the significance of this specific geography?
So the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture is located in China's Jilin province, pressed directly against the North Korean border.
Okay.
It is home to over 2 million people. But the critical demographic fact is that more than 40% of the population in Yanbian is of Korean ethnicity.
Wow, 40%.
The cultural ties, the linguistic ties, the historical family ties across that river are deep and profound. It is a highly porous, blended region.
So if we run the simulation of a North Korean regime collapse, what does that actually look like for Beijing?
It is the absolute nightmare scenario for the Chinese Communist Party.
Because of the refugees.
Exactly. If the Kim regime falls, you do not get a peaceful, orderly transition to a democratic parliament. You get instantaneous, catastrophic chaos.
Right.
You have a massive standing army whose command structure has evaporated and a population of 25 million people who are already malnourished and desperate.
So when the food distribution stops entirely...
Where is the only logical geographic place for millions of starving refugees to run? They aren't going south across the heavily mined demilitarized zone.
No, they'd be killed.
They are going north, across the shallow rivers, directly into the Yanbian Autonomous Region.
They are flooding into a Chinese province where the local population already shares their language and their ethnic heritage.
Precisely. And from the perspective of the leadership in Beijing, this isn't just a humanitarian crisis. It is a supreme threat to their internal state security and territorial integrity.
It's an invasion of desperation.
A sudden, uncontrolled influx of millions of refugees would instantly destabilize the economy of northeast China. The financial cost of housing and feeding them would be astronomical.
And the political costs.
Even worse, the potential for local unrest, the introduction of weapons from the collapsing North Korean military, and the sheer chaos of it all represents an unacceptable risk to the Chinese Communist Party's mandate of stability.
So when we look at the dynamic, China is effectively held hostage by North Korea's extreme fragility.
That's exactly it.
They are locked into providing that 98% of trade, not out of ideological brotherhood, but because the alternative is a localized apocalypse spilling directly into their own sovereign territory.
It is the ultimate paradox of leverage. North Korea's weakness is its greatest weapon against its patron. Beijing is paying exorbitant geopolitical protection money simply to maintain the status quo.
But if China is willing to pay almost any price to maintain stability and prevent chaos, how do we explain the nuclear weapons?
Ah, yes. The nukes.
Because nothing screams instability quite like a rogue authoritarian state detonating nuclear devices underground and launching intercontinental ballistic missiles over the ocean. How does China tolerate a nuclear North Korea right on its border?
That is the central dilemma of the relationship.
Yeah.
And it is important to note that China does not secretly applaud these nuclear developments. The sources show a clear history of genuine anger from Beijing regarding Pyongyang's weapons program.
Let's trace that timeline. Going back to 2006, when North Korea conducted its very first successful nuclear weapon test, the sources outline that Beijing's reaction was swift and furious.
Very furious.
The Chinese government publicly condemned the test as flagrant and brazen. That is incredibly hostile diplomatic phrasing to use against your only mutual defense ally.
Absolutely. And they backed up those words with action. China initially supported the United Nations Security Council sanctions against North Korea following that test. They wanted to signal that a nuclear peninsula was unacceptable.
But as the years went on, North Korea realized that China's fear of a regime collapse would always outweigh their anger over the nuclear tests.
They called China's bluff.
And by 2016 and 2017, North Korea began using their weapons testing program not just for scientific development, but for targeted strategic disrespect directed specifically at the leadership in Beijing.
The timing of the tests during that period is fascinating. They weren't random.
Not at all. The sources explicitly state that Pyongyang appeared to schedule these highly provocative missile launches to maximize the political embarrassment for China on the global stage.
The examples are stark. Let's look at April of 2017.
Okay, what happened then?
The President of the United States and the President of the People's Republic of China were scheduled to hold a highly anticipated high-stakes summit at the Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida.
Oh, right, a huge meeting.
This was a critical moment for Beijing to project authority, stability, and control over its sphere of influence to the American leadership.
And what does Kim Jong-un do? Right before the summit begins, he authorizes a provocative missile test. He effectively hijacks the global news cycle, forcing the Chinese delegation to answer questions about their rogue ally instead of focusing on their own strategic agenda. He essentially sent a message to Washington and Beijing saying, "You do not control me, I dictate the timeline."
And he proved it wasn't a fluke the very next month.
The Belt and Road Forum.
Yes, in May of 2017, China was hosting the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. To understand the significance of this, the Belt and Road Initiative is General Secretary Xi Jinping's massive signature global infrastructure project.
It's his legacy.
This forum was designed to be a prestige event, a grand showcase of China's economic vision and diplomatic power, with heads of state from all over the world in attendance. It was a moment of supreme national pride.
And just hours before Xi Jinping is scheduled to deliver the keynote address to the world, North Korea fires another ballistic missile.
Unbelievable timing.
The sources cite analysis from Zhao Tong, a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, who points out that this action broadcasted Pyongyang's absolute, blatant lack of concern over insulting its chief benefactor.
It was a calculated humiliation. It demonstrated that North Korea felt entirely immune to Chinese retaliation.
If we look at China's grand strategy, they must be weighing the sheer embarrassment and the regional instability caused by this nuclear neighbor against the consequences of acting against them. How does the math work out for Beijing?
It's a tough equation.
The sources outline China's 4 primary regional priorities. Let's break those down because they explain exactly why China's hands are tied.
Sure. So if we dissect Beijing's strategic calculus, priority number 1, as we extensively covered, is the absolute avoidance of a North Korean economic collapse and the resulting mass migration into northeast China.
Right, keeping the refugees out.
Internal territorial integrity supersedes everything else.
But what about the American military presence?
That is priority number 2. Preventing the United States from dominating a unified Korea. Currently, the United States maintains roughly 28,500 troops stationed in South Korea.
That's a significant force.
If the Kim regime falls, and the peninsula is unified under the democratic government in Seoul, a government deeply allied with Washington, the geopolitical map radically changes.
The buffer is gone.
Suddenly, China goes from having a buffer state to having United States military forces stationed directly on its border at the Yalu River. From Beijing's perspective, that is an existential strategic nightmare.
Which logically leads to priority number 3.
Maintaining the status quo. China deeply desires to keep the Korean peninsula divided. It is a volatile, messy, deeply imperfect situation, but it is a known quantity.
Better the devil you know.
Exactly. The one-party authoritarian state in the north, no matter how obnoxious, serves as a crucial geographical and political buffer between the Chinese mainland and the pluralist American allied democracy in the south.
And the final priority is the domestic front.
Yes, ensuring domestic stability within China itself. The Chinese Communist Party must ensure that foreign policy crises do not cascade into domestic unrest, economic disruption, or any challenge to their absolute authority at home.
So when you lay those 4 priorities out on the table, what becomes glaringly obvious is what is missing from the top of the list.
Denuclearization.
Exactly. The denuclearization of North Korea is nowhere near the top.
The mechanism driving China's policy is risk management. China officially claims it wants a denuclearized peninsula. They recognize that a nuclear North Korea invites more United States military assets into the region.
Like missile defense systems.
Right. But when forced to choose, their desire to prevent a regime collapse and maintain that buffer state against American influence is ultimately a vastly higher priority. They will swallow their pride and tolerate the nuclear headache to avoid the geopolitical catastrophe of a unified, U.S.-aligned Korea.
Let's contextualize this nuclear headache, because the sources provide an incredibly illuminating map estimating the global nuclear warhead inventories projected for the year 2025.
The numbers are pretty revealing.
I want to read these numbers because the disparity is shocking. The United States possesses over 5,200 nuclear warheads. Russia possesses over 5,500. China possesses roughly 600.
And North Korea's arsenal.
North Korea is estimated to have roughly 50 warheads. 50 warheads going up against thousands.
It's a tiny fraction.
So the obvious question is, how does an arsenal of 50 warheads manage to hold the entire Northeast Asian region hostage? And from a strategic standpoint, does Beijing secretly view those 50 warheads as a highly convenient, chaotic shield against the United States?
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. While Beijing genuinely despises the unpredictability of Kim Jong-un's finger on the button, Those 50 warheads perform a very specific strategic function.
How so?
They act as an ultimate asymmetric distraction. They force the United States military and intelligence apparatus to constantly dedicate massive resources, planning, and attention toward mitigating a rogue strike from Pyongyang.
It creates a permanent friction point.
Precisely. It is a crisis that never fully resolves. And every satellite, every carrier strike group, and every diplomat focused on containing North Korea's 50 warheads is a resource that the United States cannot dedicate to countering China's strategic maneuvers in the South China Sea or focusing entirely on the defense of Taiwan.
Ah, I see.
North Korea acts as the ultimate wild card, keeping Washington perpetually off balance, which indirectly serves China's broader ambitions.
But the true terror of those 50 warheads isn't just that they exist. It is the specific military doctrine dictating exactly how and when North Korea plans to use them.
This is where it gets really dark.
And that brings us to the most chilling analysis in our reading, the terrifying logic of the use it or lose it first strike scenario.
To understand this doctrine, you really have to look past the propaganda videos of massive military parades in Pyongyang and analyze the actual physical state of the Korean People's Army.
Right, because on paper, the Korean People's Army is a behemoth. It is one of the largest standing armies on the planet.
On paper.
But the reports paint a picture of a military apparatus that has been entirely hollowed out from the inside.
The sheer size of the force is an illusion masking deep structural rot. The equipment they are fielding is technologically decades out of date, heavily reliant on Soviet-era designs from the 1950s and 60s.
It belongs in a museum.
Pretty much. Because of the strict international sanctions, they are completely cut off from importing modern microchips, advanced targeting systems, or modern replacement parts.
And the logistical realities are even worse.
They lack the adequate fuel reserves necessary to run prolonged mobile military operations. You cannot conduct modern maneuver warfare without diesel. And perhaps most tragic of all, the sources highlight the human toll. The chronic severe malnutrition that plagues the country deeply affects the physical health, stamina, and combat readiness of the average North Korean soldier.
So if a conflict were to erupt, you have a massive physically depleted army operating obsolete tanks with no fuel reserves.
That's grim.
And on the other side of the demilitarized zone, you have the combined forces of the United States and the Republic of Korea. These allied forces boast absolute, overwhelming superiority in every single domain of modern warfare.
Logistics, communications, intelligence, everything.
They have encrypted communications, real-time satellite intelligence, stealth capabilities, and precision-guided munitions.
It's not a peer-to-peer conflict. It is a catastrophic mismatch. However, North Korea holds one massive, terrifying geographic advantage that dictates the entire flow of potential war.
The proximity of the South Korean capital.
Yes. The center of gravity for the Republic of Korea is the massive Seoul-Gyeonggi-Incheon corridor. It is the economic, cultural, and population heart of the entire nation, home to tens of millions of people.
And it's right on the border.
Geographically, it sits uncomfortably close to the demilitarized zone. The sources note that North Korean conventional forces are massed directly flush against the border, equipped with thousands of conventional artillery pieces that are already dialed in and capable of inflicting massive bombardment on the greater Seoul metropolitan area within minutes.
But even with that devastating artillery threat, the military reality is that in any full-scale conflict, the United States and South Korean forces would instantaneously establish total air supremacy over the peninsula.
Within hours.
They would launch massive, coordinated disarming strikes. They would send stealth bombers and cruise missiles to systematically eliminate North Korean command and control bunkers, missile silos, air defense radars, and those massive artillery emplacements.
And that precise tactical reality is what creates the use it or lose it dilemma.
Explain the mechanism behind that dilemma. What is the psychological calculus for Kim Jong-un the second the first shot is fired?
Think of it like a standoff in a Western movie, where one gunslinger knows his draw is incredibly slow. The moment the saloon doors open, he knows he cannot win a prolonged shootout.
So he has to fire immediately.
His only chance of survival is to fire his weapon instantly, before the other guy even clears his holster. Operationally, the leadership in Pyongyang knows with absolute certainty that they have an incredibly narrow time window to utilize their weapons of mass destruction.
Because if they wait, an imminent, overwhelming, disarming strike by Allied air power is going to obliterate those weapons in their silos. If Kim Jong-un tries to hold his nuclear arsenal in reserve as a bargaining chip,
they will be destroyed.
And if he loses his nuclear deterrent, the conflict immediately reverts to a purely conventional war.
And as we just outlined, a conventional war with a starving, out-of-gas, obsolete military against the United States is a war that North Korea loses in a matter of days.
Exactly. So the weakness of their conventional forces actually makes a nuclear strike infinitely more likely.
It does.
The sources suggest that Kim has overwhelming tactical incentives to use his tactical nuclear weapons first at the very onset of hostilities. The goal wouldn't be to win the war, it would be to cause such massive, shocking casualties that it shatters the political will of the Allies, forcing them to halt their advance out of sheer terror and agree to a ceasefire.
That completely inverts the traditional Cold War theory of nuclear deterrence.
It really does.
The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was built on the idea that nobody fires a nuclear weapon because firing ensures your own death. But for North Korea, firing their nuclear weapons first is seen as their literal only mechanism for survival.
If we look at the grand strategy analysis provided in the sources, there is a profound difference between the existential reality of North Korea and other nuclear-armed powers like Russia or China.
Oh, massive.
Let's look at Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. If Russia suffers a total military defeat in Ukraine, it is a humiliation, but it does not inherently mean the end of the Russian state or an invasion of Moscow.
Right, Russia survives.
Similarly, if China were to be militarily defeated in a hypothetical conflict attempting to take Taiwan, the geopolitical blowback would be massive, but it would not lead to an allied invasion of the Chinese mainland or the collapse of the nation.
But for the Kim regime, the stakes are totally different.
It's all or nothing.
For the Kim dynasty, any serious military conflict on the Korean peninsula rapidly, inevitably becomes existential. A defeat does not mean a loss of territory. It means the total annihilation of the regime.
Regime change.
It means regime change, war crimes tribunals, the end of their existence. Because the consequences of losing are absolute, the incentive to launch nuclear weapons first, to deter or slow an Allied march northward, is absolute.
Which means that any minor border skirmish, any naval miscalculation, has the immediate potential to rapidly escalate into a nuclear exchange simply because Pyongyang operates from a posture of extreme paranoia, feeling constantly backed into an existential corner.
It's a hair-trigger environment.
And that terrifying reality transitions us to our final area of analysis, how North Korea is manipulating the current shift in global power dynamics to survive. The trilateral threat and the emergence of a new Cold War architecture.
We are witnessing the tectonic plates of global geopolitics shifting in real time. As the strategic competition and military tensions between the United States and its major adversaries intensify, North Korea is not just observing the chaos, they are actively capitalizing on it.
The sources highlight Pyongyang's immediate and unequivocal support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
They jumped right in.
They didn't just stay neutral. North Korean state media released statements actively blaming the United States as the, quote, root cause of the European crisis. They echoed Moscow's talking points, claiming that Washington arrogantly disregarded Russia's legitimate security demands.
But the alliance has moved far beyond rhetorical support. The material support is what represents a massive paradigm shift.
What are they sending?
Well, United States intelligence officials have documented that while China has been providing economic cushioning and dual-use technology to support Russia's defense industrial base, North Korea has crossed a much redder line.
Lethal aid.
Yes, they have directly supplied vast quantities of artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and, according to recent reports, even deployed their own soldiers to aid the Russian military in the war in Ukraine.
It is a stunning reversal of historical roles. A heavily sanctioned, impoverished nation whose population struggles with malnutrition is actively exporting heavy weaponry and manpower to sustain a supposed global superpower in a major land war.
Something nobody predicted a decade ago.
And the diplomatic return on that investment for Pyongyang has been massive. The relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang has warmed to levels not seen since the height of the Soviet era.
It's a full-blown partnership again.
In June of 2024, Vladimir Putin made a highly publicized, symbolic visit to Pyongyang.
And the culmination of that visit was the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership.
Exactly. Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a mutual defense treaty. The sources note that the language in this new treaty actively revives the exact kind of mutual assistance pledges from their old Cold War-era defense pact, a pact that Russia had deliberately scrapped back in the 1990s when they were trying to integrate with the West.
The resurrection of that treaty signals that Moscow is intent on fracturing the United States-led international order, and they are perfectly willing to make common cause with global pariah states to achieve it.
They are actively recruiting an axis of ideological allies dedicated to disruption.
So we have an increasingly aggressive North Korea, newly emboldened and armed by a mutual defense pact with Russia. Where does China fit into this budding, disruptive romance? Because the analysis suggests that Beijing is performing an incredibly delicate, uncomfortable diplomatic dance.
China's position is highly complex. On one hand, their entire grand strategy relies on maintaining relatively stable, functional economic ties with the United States and the European Union.
They need the global economy.
Their economy is deeply integrated into global trade. Therefore, the leadership in Beijing desperately wants to avoid being explicitly grouped into a formal trilateral axis alongside two rogue nations, Russia and North Korea, who are actively blowing up the international security architecture.
Right. Being officially branded as the leader of an axis of bad guys is catastrophic for Chinese global business interests and their desire to be seen as a responsible global stakeholder.
Exactly. However, their geopolitical goals frequently align with Moscow's when it comes to shielding Pyongyang from Western pressure. We saw this play out starkly at the United Nations.
Vetoes.
On January 20th, 2022, both China and Russia formally blocked the United Nations Security Council from imposing any further sanctions against North Korea following a series of illegal ballistic missile tests.
And what was China's excuse for blocking it?
China's diplomatic excuse was that they needed more time to study the proposed sanctions.
Which is a classic transparent stalling tactic.
It was a deliberate veto hidden behind bureaucratic procedure. Furthermore, in recent years, both Beijing and Moscow have actively collaborated to push the United Nations to actually lift existing international sanctions on North Korea, using the deteriorating humanitarian situation in the country as their justification.
So they play both sides.
So they provide diplomatic cover by vetoing punishments, while simultaneously providing the economic backdoor to keep the regime afloat.
And this coordinated protection from both Beijing and Moscow serves as a massive accelerant for Kim Jong-un. As long as he maintains utility for Russia by providing weapons and utility for China by acting as a buffer state, he knows he is insulated from the most severe punitive measures the United States might attempt to impose.
He has a blank check.
He has the geopolitical space to test his missiles and expand his nuclear arsenal as freely and frequently as he desires.
Because ultimately, all three of these nations, China, Russia, and North Korea, are united by one overriding fundamental strategic objective:
the eradication of United States military influence in Northeast Asia.
That is the glue holding this dynamic together. They share a mutual desire to dramatically reduce and eventually eliminate the American military footprint on the Asian continent.
That's the ultimate prize for them.
Specifically, the sources highlight their coordinated opposition to the deployment of the United States Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Systems in South Korea.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that specific system, because the Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense is constantly mentioned as a flashpoint.
It is.
On the surface, it is a purely defensive system designed to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles fired from North Korea. So why does China view a defensive system in South Korea as an aggressive threat?
The controversy isn't about the interceptor missiles themselves. It is entirely about the radar system that comes with them.
Oh, the radar.
The radar associated with that defense system is incredibly powerful. To track a North Korean missile launch in real time, the radar's sensors must peer deep into the airspace of the Asian mainland.
Oh, I see.
From Beijing's perspective, placing that powerful American radar on the Korean peninsula allows the United States military to monitor Chinese airspace, track Chinese missile tests, and potentially compromise China's own nuclear deterrent capabilities.
So China perceives it as an American surveillance apparatus disguised as South Korean missile defense.
Exactly. And beyond removing that defense system, all three nations share the goal of terminating the joint military exercises conducted between the United States and the Republic of Korea. They view these drills as provocative rehearsals for an invasion of the North.
The analyses in our sources present a very concerning theory regarding North Korea's repeated missile testing. We often assume that Pyongyang acts out to force the United States back to the negotiating table to beg for sanctions relief.
Like it's just a shakedown.
Right. But the sources suggest a much more aggressive strategy. They posit that the missile tests are a deliberate campaign to elevate the threat level so high that the United States is forced to make major preemptive concessions.
Like permanently halting those joint military drills or removing the missile defense systems.
Before North Korea will even consider opening a dialogue.
And any reduction in United States military readiness or presence in South Korea is a massive strategic victory for both China and Russia. North Korea acts as the aggressive vanguard, doing the dirty work of directly threatening Washington, while Beijing and Moscow quietly reap the geopolitical benefits of an America that is constantly distracted, pressured, and forced to compromise in the Pacific.
And this is exactly why this complex web of resentments and alliances matters so deeply to you, the listener, today.
It really does.
Because as the great power competition between the United States and China intensifies across multiple domains, trade wars, the status of Taiwan, technological supremacy, North Korea is actively using the friction between Washington and Beijing as a protective shield.
They are exploiting the rift.
They are aggressively, relentlessly advancing their weapons of mass destruction programs under the cover of this broader global rivalry. The title of one of the presentations we reviewed asks a chilling question. Is North Korea preparing for war, mere blustering, or something in between?
And what's the verdict?
When you look at the evidence, the line separating blustering from active preparation for conflict is becoming dangerously, terrifyingly thin.
We are observing the hardening of a highly polarized global security architecture. For the time being, both Beijing and Moscow have clearly calculated that strengthening their ties with Pyongyang and utilizing North Korea to harass the West is a significantly higher strategic priority than enforcing denuclearization.
Their primary goal is to deter and degrade the power projection of America and its democratic allies in the region.
And that strategic calculation creates the exact geopolitical vacuum that allows Kim Jong-un to survive, adapt, and continually upgrade his lethal capabilities.
We have covered a phenomenal amount of complex strategic ground today.
We really have. Let's do a quick recap. We started by completely deconstructing the myth of the monolithic communist alliance. By diving into the history, we uncovered that China and North Korea are not ideological brothers, but rather historic frenemies.
Bound by a treaty, but divided by resentment.
They are bound together by a 1961 mutual defense treaty, but deeply divided by decades of intense resentment, tracing all the way back to Mao Zedong sacrificing North Korean sovereignty to bleed the United States during the Korean War.
We then explored the mechanics of their modern relationship, defined entirely by an economic chokehold. China provides 98% of North Korea's trade, not out of any sense of charity or loyalty, but out of a profound, paralyzing fear of internal instability.
The refugee nightmare.
Beijing is terrified that if the Kim regime collapses, millions of desperate refugees will flood across the Yalu River into China's Yanbian region, triggering a massive domestic crisis.
From there, we analyzed the terrifying military reality on the peninsula. The severe conventional weakness of the Korean People's Army, an army struggling with outdated equipment, fuel shortages, and malnutrition, actually creates an extreme, highly volatile, use-it-or-lose-it scenario.
We detailed how, if a conflict were to ignite, Kim Jong-un's only logical military move to ensure the survival of his regime is to launch tactical nuclear weapons first, before Allied air power can destroy them.
And finally, we examined how this regional powder keg connects to the current global instability. North Korea is capitalizing on the war in Ukraine, actively aligning with Russia, trading artillery for a mutual defense pact, and utilizing the diplomatic protection provided by both Moscow and Beijing at the United Nations to rapidly advance its nuclear ambitions and attempt to push the United States out of Northeast Asia.
It is a staggering level of complexity, and again, as we emphasized at the beginning of this deep dive, our role has simply been to map out the doctrines, the historical mechanisms, and the high-stakes geopolitical realities presented in these comprehensive sources.
We are laying the puzzle pieces on the table, examining how they fit together without taking any political sides. But before we conclude today, I want to leave you with one final, highly provocative thought drawn directly from our reading material. A wildcard scenario for you to mull over.
The potential for a massive regional paradigm shift.
Exactly. We have spent this entire discussion analyzing how North Korea expertly manipulates both China and the United States. We have detailed the severe military threat posed to South Korea. But here is the variable that could completely shatter the current geopolitical equation.
This is huge.
Recent public opinion polls cited in the analyses reveal a shocking trend. A large, growing majority of South Korean citizens now support their country acquiring its own independent nuclear weapons arsenal.
It represents a massive historic shift in public sentiment within a democratic nation. It is driven not only by the terrifying reality of North Korea's advancing nuclear capabilities, but also by public polling showing that many South Koreans increasingly view the sheer size and ambition of China as their greatest long-term threat.
So think through the implications of this scenario. If the citizens of South Korea decide that the United States nuclear umbrella is no longer a sufficient guarantee of their survival, and Seoul decides to build the bomb, how does Beijing react?
How does the Chinese Communist Party respond to the sudden reality of a fully nuclear-armed, technologically advanced, democratic nation allied with the United States sitting directly on its doorstep?
Would the sheer terror of a nuclear South Korea finally be the catalyst that forces China to definitively cut Pyongyang loose? Or would it trigger an unprecedented, spiraling regional arms race across all of Asia?
It is the ultimate unknown variable in an already hyper-volatile region. The current status quo, built on historical resentment and economic hostage-taking, is incredibly fragile, and all the variables are shifting rapidly.
It brings us right back to that broken diplomatic X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning. The geopolitical image is profoundly murky, the historical fractures run deep, and the long-term diagnosis for the region is anything but simple. Thank you so much for taking this intensive deep dive with us today. Keep questioning those surface-level narratives of foreign policy, keep looking for the hidden mechanisms of power, and we will catch you on the next one.